This is Gemara Zevachim Daf Gimel. We'll learn if this month, the month of Elul, has been generously sponsored by a close friend of the Daf as a Schos Aliyas Neshama for his mother, Aster Rייזel Basar מאיר. P'siyata D'Shemaya, the incredible Koyach HaTorah, should bring the Neshama of Aster Rייזel Basar מאיר to incredibly high place in Gan Eden Shel Meila. We're holding on the very bottom of Beis and Beis. We're in the middle of trying to find the makar that stama by a get is possible. The contrast between stama by Zevachim, our sugya, and stama by get. We already discussed the makar, why stama by Zevachim is going to be kosher, that their korban stam is oimed for zvicha, whereas an isha stam is not oimed for gerushin. And now the Gemara is in the middle of discussing the get, the stama pasul minalan. 8 lines from the bottom. Where do we know that by get the stama is that it's not going to work? So we tried one attempt, it didn't work. Says the Gemara, Ella meha. Rather, it's from here as we turn over to Daf Gimel Amud Aleph. Continues the Mishnah on Gittin, and hopefully, and as much as Gittin was quite some time ago, hopefully we have some familiarity with the concepts based on that which we learned then. Ela meha, says the Gemara, rather, it's from the end of the Mishnah. Yeser al kain, says the Mishnah, more than this. Costly Gary says if someone writes a get to divorce his wife in Imlach, and then he decides, you know what, no reason to get divorced. And lo and behold, matzah ben irai. What happens is, he finds someone in his city of Amr Loi Shemi Keshibcha V'Shemishti Keshemishticha. My name is the same as yours. Our wives have the same name. So let me give you the get, and you could use the get to divorce your wife. What's the halacha? Pasul ligarish by. So what do we see? We see seemingly that stam by get, that if a get is not written with specific kavana, it's pasul. Says the Gemara, no raya. Maybe this case is different. Why? Because in this case, the get was written for the first guy. So now he doesn't want to use it. Can the second guy use it? Says the Mishnah, no. But does that show me that a parav get, that a stam get wouldn't be good? Not necessarily. Because again, whenever you're dealing with kavana, you have positive kavana, you have negative kavana, and you have no kavana. So over here, you had positive kavanah for A, for Reuven and Sarah. Now we want to transfer it to Reuven B and Sarah B, says the Mishnah. No. Does that show me that stam doesn't work? No. Maybe the reason it doesn't work is because there was a level of intent for the first guy. Says the Gemara, Elameha, on the 5th line. Yes, Al Kain continue the Gemara and Gittin, Yesh Shtei Nashim. If someone has 2 wives, Sheshmoisehem Shavais, the exact same name, Koslegarish Zegedayla. If he writes a get to divorce the older one, Legarish Vasekatana, you cannot divorce the younger one. So over here, even though it's all coming from the same person, we see seemingly having intent not specifically for the person is a problem. So this is a raya that stama is not going to work. Says the Gemara, no, Dilma shiny asam the intkile l'shem girish and dahi. Again, over here it has to do with the woman. It's the same man. You're right, but over here you have the problem that he wrote it for wife A, the older one. So now you can't use it to the younger one because again there was positive kavana for one of them. Elameha continues the Gemara. Yeser al Kain 10 lines down. Amar lelablar, if someone says to a scribe, Ksoiv write write a get for me, and then I will decide afterwards who to divorce. The guy has 2 wives. So he says to the Sefer, listen, write me a get, I'll pay you, and then I'll decide. I'm not sure that I want to divorce my first wife, my second wife, I'll figure it out afterwards. Says the Gemara in Gittin, Basel Garishvai. You can't use such a get. So Gemara says, wow, this is Gavaldik. It was written specifically for this guy. It was written for one of his 2 wives, and we see it doesn't work. Seemingly, this is a raya that you need to have specific intent. Says the Gemara, no, Dalmi Shani Asam de Ein Breira. That case is different. Because again, over here, he has some level of kavanah for either wife A or wife B. And then the concept, the musig, the mechanics of Breira, which are what? Which are the fact that we could say, perhaps, retroactively, it's clarified that I had this in mind. That's the shayla if it works. And the Gemara in Gittin says, no, Breira, retroactive clarification, will not work. But does that show me that ostensibly having no kavana, stoma, wouldn't work? No. Again, maybe some level of kavana makes it worse over here because he had in mind one of his two wives. Says the Gemara, Elameha, another attempt. Says the Gemara Gittin, if someone is writing the typeface, the extra parts of the get, he has to leave out the critical details, the tayrif of the get. Tayrif and lashon of Torah. He has to leave out the name of the man, the name of the woman, the name of the edim, V'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Avsar sheiniach makam areya mutares l'chol adam. So says the Gemara, this is going to be a raya. We see from over here that if you don't leave out the specifics of a get, it's not gonna work. So clearly says the Gemara, here's a raya that a stam get, a stama lishma by gittin will not work, and that is the final raya. Whereas we see that by Zevachim by stama would work, and by get it would not work. Continues the Gemara. We're 15 lines down. We basically wrapped up part A. Part A being the contrast between our Mishnah of Kol HaZvachim, all karbanos that were shechted, or other avodas, as we'll see more today, shalei lishma, what the status is, in contrast to gittin, which is the kasha of Rava. The Gemara continues with another kasha. Su Rami Milsa Achriti. Rava then had another kasha. And this really is, if you remember in the previous year on Bezim and Bez, Ravina told Rav Papa, you weren't here in Shir today, that Rava had a bunch of Givaldik kashas and a bunch of Terutzim. So the first kasha that we dealt with, which is what is really our sugya, is the contrast between Zevachim, Stama Lishma, and Gittin. But now says the Gemara, let me tell you another kasha of Rava. Mi Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, said Rava, did Rav Yehuda Amar Rav say, Chata shachta l'shem oila psula, if a chatas was shachted as an oila, then it's possible. Whereas, shachta l'shem chulin, if it wasn't shachted for any specific carbon, who was shachted stam for shchita, for eating it, then kshira. So Alma, what do we see? What's the math? If I shecht a carbon chatas and have intent for a carbon oila, a different carbon, it messes me up. But if I shecht a carbon chatas and I have in mind not for a carbon at all, but rather I have in mind stam for shchita, then it's kosher. Alma dimina machriva. That when you do something of its kind, you have in mind from a different carbon, it messes you up. Tilav mina loy machriva. But if you don't have intent for its kind, you have intent as a stam shchita, then it doesn't mess you up. So says the Gemara, the math is depending on what level of wrong intent you have. Again, if you have intent for the wrong item, dilav mina, a non-carbon at all, that doesn't mess you up. If you have intent for a carbon, but the wrong carbon, that yes, mess you up. V'ramini, I'll ask you a stira. Kol get shenichtav l'shaloi l'shem isha. Any get that is written not for a woman, pasol. V'afilu l'shem avodas kachavim. Even if the get is written not for this woman, but shaloi mina. If the get is written for someone who has no shaykhis, the get is written for a guy, it's pasol. Says the Gemara, why is that true? If it's written for a guy that's called shaloi mina, that should be comparable to what? The shchita of the chatas for chulin. So why by shchita of the chatas for chulin do we say it's kosher, but the get for a guy we say is possible? In the math, it should be the same. That was Rava's kasha. Vishani and answered Rava, and this really is a perfect first cousin to our sugya. Get if by get subtract whatever your kavana was. Your kavana was for a gaita. Subtract that you wrote it for a guy. Then what? Who was the get written for? No one. That's called havale stama. And what's the halacha by a stam get? Ustama pasal. Whereas kachim, when it comes to a carbon, dal chulin minayu. If you get rid of the fact that it was shechted for no apparent purpose, for chulin, havale stama. So why did you shech this chata stam? And what's the halacha by a stam carbon? Ustama is kshirim. So that is how Rava answered up stira number 2. Continues the Gemara, V'rama mil sachriti. We're about 20 lines at the bottom. First one line is kshirim. Another kasha, another stira that Rava asked. Mi Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Chata shechtu l'shem ha'ila psula. Shacht a chata that is shechted for ha'ila is possible. Shacht l'shem chulin is kshira. Alma, this is what we just said, the same first case. Demina, if it's its type, it's another carbon, it's machrava, messes you up. Okay, but now, so the first theory he asked was to get. And by get, we answered, subtract that entity, and then we can figure out what's going on. Says the Gemara, I'll ask you another kasha. Tanya, I'll ask you another brayso. And again, this kasha is really going to zero in just on the general klal. This klal of demina, if it's its type, it messes, and not its type, it doesn't mess up. Says the brayso, demina vatanya, toichai, if with regard to toma, if something falls toichai inside a keli, it becomes tameh. Not if it goes in the inside of the inside. And even a keli, an item, a movable and immersible item that's inside another keli, is a matzil. It saves from tama. So the kasha of the Gemara is, even though these are completely different items, the kli shetef, even though it's a lav mina, what do we see? We see it still as matzil. The question is, we just said lav mina doesn't mess you up. What did we just say? What was Rav Yehuda Marav's klal? His klal was, if it's mina, messes you up. If it's lav mina, doesn't mess you up. But over here we see if it's a lav mina and it saves from toma, that means it causes a block. So that would be the same thing as messing you up. Vishani, and we answered, also chulin eitzel kachim. We have to make chulin by kachim kemachita eitzel tanur, like a partition regarding an oven. Not like our case of a keli, but rather like the case of an oven. If you put a partition in an oven and then there's tuma on one side of the oven, it does not block it. So too by kachim, it doesn't block it at all. If we have an oven that is partitioned with boards or curtains, if your name says sharets for 6 lines to the bottom of Makam Echad, and you find the sharets there are kol tamei, the curtains, the boards do not block, and everything is tamei. Whereas kaveres, you have a beehive or a basket shaped sucha that has holes, upakuka, and you shtup up, you plug up the holes bekash with straw, umishul sheles lavir, and it's hanging into the airspace of atanor, of the oven. Then sharets b'seicha. If you have a sheretz inside the oven, hatanor tamei. Sheretz b'tanor, if you have sheretz b'seicha, tanor tamei. Sheretz b'tanor, again, b'seicha means it's inside the kaveres, it's inside this hive, this basket, and it's tamei. But if the sheretz is not there, but rather where's the sheretz in the tanor? Oichlan sheb'seicha tameihin, Rav Eliezer mitaher. Oh, my Rebbe Eliezer, 2 lines to the bottom, Kalva Chaimer. Says Rebbe Eliezer, I'll tell you Kalva Chaimer. Im hitzel b'meis hachamor. If a partition could block tuma when it comes to a meis, or titzel b'kli chares hakal, should it not block by a kli chares? An amru loy, the Rabbanim responded to Rebbe Eliezer, loy, no, it can't block. Why not? As we turn over to Gimel Amid Beis, explains the Chachamim, Im hitzel b'meiz chamor. If it blocked by the case of meiz, which is more chamor, shekain, what's the reason? Cholkin ba'oyalin. The reason being that people could act as a partition, which do not generally form a partition. So this is the end of the Mishnah quoted. So we see from this Mishnah that when it comes to the case of the ovens, it's not going to be the same thing as the case by us when it comes to Kalim. So explains the Gemara 3 lines down. This is all good according to the Rabbanon, the Tanakam, Rav Eliezer, Michael and Meir. According to Rav Eliezer, he argues. According to Rav Eliezer, the partition would yes prevent the food from becoming tamei. The partition is lav mina. It's in a different category entirely from the oven. So we see that lav mina could act as a block, not like Rava said. Answers the Gemara, Rav Eliezer, Kal v'chaymer kamar. Rav Eliezer learns this case of a Kal v'chaymer, so you can't apply this rule elsewhere, because this is a Kal v'chaymer. Says the Gemara, wait, Yachi Yasa Nami Lema Kal v'chaymer. Let's say the same Kal v'chaymer by us. Kachim achalim. Kachim. If you have the wrong kavanah by kachim, it messes up kachim. Chulin like kashkein. It says certainly mess up chulin. So says the Gemara, why don't we say the same thought process by us? In the case of your chata sheshachtan l'shem chulin, it should yes mess up your chatas, not like we said. Ela taima derav kirav Eliezer. Dam derav Eliezer, excuse me. Dam Rav Eliezer my taima derav. What's reason for Rav? V'lo yechalu es kachem b'nei Yisrael. Says the Torah, they should not be machalal, make profane those that are holy in b'nei Yisrael as asher arim Hashem, that which they separate for Hashem. Kachim mechalim, kachim. From this pasuk, it's a limud akra. From the pasuk, we learn that kachim are mess up other kachim. But ve'ein chulim mechalim v'kachim, but chulin cannot mess up, and therefore, circling full circle, if you shecht your chatas b'kavana chulin does not mess up kachim. If you shecht your chatas b'kavana kachim, b'kavana oila, then it could mess you up. Alma, so says the Gemara, 1 second. Asakra, afkim a kal v'chaymer. So we see the pasuk is coming and negating kal v'chaymer. Hachanami leisa teichai lefkei mikal v'chaymer. So now the Gemara says, circle back around to our case in the ovens. Why does the pasuk negate the kal v'chaymer? Answers the Gemara, I tell about lil eichlen shegibalan betit. The teichlet, this word teichai, we need for another din with regard to tumah v'tayra, food that is coated with clay, v'chinasan lavir atayno, and it's put inside the oven. I would think since it's not mitame benigil with tachki, it's not mitame. They are space kamashon that it is mitame. V'rabbanan, what do they respond? They don't need a pasuk. So this last detail is just wrapping up the dinim, but this is going to finally answer up the chilek between mina and lav mina. Lav mina being machriv or not. Says the Gemara, you can't ask a stira for these dinim of tumah v'tayra, because this is being learned from a pasuk. Continues the Gemara, and really after all those questions of Ravha, we circle back around. Rav Yosef Barami Rami. Rav Yosef Barami asks, Shinei Kodesh Shinei Bailim. He asks, Shinei Kodesh to Shinei Bailim. Now this is very important. When we started the Mishnah, and we said, Kol Zevachim Shachtan Shaloi Lishman, we said there's 2 types of mess ups you could have. You could have a kavana, you could have a thought process. I'm shechting this chatos as an oila. I'm shechting this carbon for the wrong entity. Or that's shinoi kodesh, you mess up in the kodesh. Or you could have kavana shinoi bailim. You mess up in the bailim. So we until now were discussing messing up in the kodesh. Rav Yosef Barami says the same kasha messing up in the bailim. Umishani, and he answered it. First he says, what's the kasha? Mi amarav chatas sheshachtu l'shem chatas ksheira l'shem oila psula. Did Rav really say that stira? Alma d'lav mina macharba mina loy macharba. What's the kasha of amarav chatas sheshachtu al mi shemechuyev chatas? Shech the carbon for someone who's mechuyev chatas. it is psula. Ambisha mechuyev oila, it's ksheira. So this is more of a direct kasha. Forget about asking from our case of karbanos to our case of gittin. Says Rav Yosef bar Ami, let's ask directly. If you shecht your chatos for a chatos, it's good. You shecht for an oila, it's no good. What do we see? Again, this is not the exact case. Before we said chatos for a oila or chatos for chulin. Here, they're both for karbanos. You did it for the right intent, it's good. You did it for the wrong intent, it's not good. So what do we see? Delav mina, if you shachta for the wrong reason, you chatas for your oila, very simply, is machrva. But asks Rav, if you shachta chatas, so that's mechuyev chatas, chatas shechachta almi shemechuyev chatas psula. However, but if you shechted your chat of someone that was mechuyev in ayla, then it's going to be kosher. What's the case? The case is you did it for the wrong person. The koyin shechted not for Ruvain but for Shimon. So if he shechted it, the chatos was shechted for someone else that also needed a chatos, then it messes you up. But if the koyin shechted not for the Ruvain but for Shimon, and Shimon didn't need a chatos at all, then it's ksheira. So says the Gemara, what do you see? Alma devar mina machriva, the exact opposite. If it's type, if it's for someone who needed to bring a chatos, it's possible. Delav mina loy machriva. If someone doesn't need to bring it, it's not possible. So ask Rav Yosef bar Ami Astira b'nei ubei. You just told me a chatos that you brought for a chatos is good, a chatos for an oil is no good. But yet, if you mess it up for a different bailim and that bailim needs the same carbon, it's no good. Umishani. And he answered as follows: Hosam, with regard to the Shinei Kodesh, chatos for an oila, v'shachtas ala chatos amarachmana, for a chatosim chatos nishchata, and therefore it's kosher. But achav chibar alav kasiv alav. But ksiv over here it says you shachta for this owner. Alav has to be for him. V'loy al chaveiroi, and chaveiroi dum yadidei shemechuyev kapara kamaisai. So says the Gemara, even though maybe in the math it seems funny that a chatos for an oila is no good, but a chatos for someone else who is mechuyev an oila is good, says the Gemara. It's not shver, it's all psukim. Rav Chaviva Rami, very similarly, Shinei Bailim, he asked the case of Shinei Bailim, back in our case of the shratzim inside the oven, umeshani, miya merav, chatos shachto amisha mechuyev, chatos psula, mishav chulayev kshira. Almost, what do we see? The same cloud. Mina machrba, lamina loy machrba. V'atanya teicha v'lo teicha afilu kli shetev matzil umeshani afilu kli shetev matzil. So what do we see? We see that if it's lav mina, it does block the tama. So astira umeshani arba teicha ksivi. It says we're teicha 4 times. Teicha. And what do we learn out from this? Chali gufei. V'chad l'gzera shava, chad teicha shel zeh, v'loy teicha shel acher, miyot, edach teicha, v'loy teicha, v'afilu klishet matzil. It's going to be gzera psychosis, so you can't ask from here. And that ends the segment of contradictions between Kachim and Gat. We started between Kachim and Tahira, teicha or not. Then we circled around to the stira between Shinei Bailim and Shinei Kodesh, and now finally we circled back around into the case of Tumah V'Taira. We'll stop over here. We'll pick it up on the top of Taf Daled B'siyata Dishmaya.